On the morning of August 18th, 1988, the smoke arrived before the sun did. It drifted over the vineyards and hay fields of Lake County, California, turning the sky the color of worn copper. Sheriff deputies drove the gravel roads, warning ranchers to prepare for evacuation, while water tenders rattled toward the hills where lightning had ignited dry chaparral the night before. Most people looked toward the mountains with fear. One young girl walked the other way. She carried a shovel across her shoulder and began cutting down healthy rows of grapevines with quiet determination. From the road, it looked like madness. By noon, half the valley had heard about her. They say she's ruining the only thing that can keep that place alive. One neighbor muttered outside the feed store in Lower Lake. Another shook his head. Poor child must have lost hope. But hope had very little to do with what Emily Harper, 19 years old, was doing that morning. She had grown up on those 42 acres beneath the shadow of Mount Canocti, where every fence post carried a story and every orchard row remembered someone who had planted it. Her father had died when she was 12. Her mother followed 6 years later after a long illness. The land became hers before she was old enough to understand how heavy that gift could be. The only person who stayed beside her was Walter Briggs, 73 years old, whose hands looked as though they had been carved from weathered walnut. He had farmed neighboring ground since the early 1940s. His boots were always polished by dust instead of polish. His eyes never hurried, even when everyone else did. Walter never claimed to know everything. He simply paid attention longer than everyone else. Let me tell you about Walter Briggs. He bought his first 10 acres in 1947 after returning from the Pacific. The bank loan was $2,900. Enough to frighten him every night for nearly a decade. Yet he never missed a payment. He believed every fence should stand straight, every tool should be cleaned before supper, and every decision should leave the land healthier than he found it. People sometimes mistook his silence for uncertainty. It never was. Parked inside his red wooden equipment shed rested the machine he trusted most, a 1954 Farmall Super M-TA. Rated at nearly 54 horsepower, weighing just over 5,500 pounds, purchased secondhand in 1959 from a dealer in Ukiah for $2,350. Walter changed its oil every spring whether it needed it or not. Every grease fitting received attention every 50 hours. The original cast-iron engine still carried the faint machining marks left by the factory decades earlier. Most neighbors called it outdated. Walter called it dependable. Emily had learned to drive that tractor before she learned to drive a pickup. That morning she climbed onto its worn steel seat, started the engine, and pulled a heavy brush mower toward the western edge of her vineyard. Instead of saving vines, she destroyed them. Long strips disappeared behind the blades. Dust climbed into the smoky air. When Daniel Mercer, a 34-year-old vineyard development consultant hired by several successful wineries in neighboring Napa County, arrived in his spotless white pickup, he slammed the door hard enough for everyone nearby to notice. "What are you doing?" he shouted. Emily stopped the tractor. "I'm making room." "For what?" "For the fire." Daniel stared at the freshly cleared strips running through the vineyard. Then he laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a polite laugh. The kind of loud, confident laugh meant to tell everyone else exactly who was supposed to be the smartest person in the conversation. Several contractors standing beside his truck joined in. "She's mowing down productive vines," one said. Daniel wiped tears from his eyes. "I've spent 10 years helping vineyards increase production," he said. "And this girl thinks the answer is destroying her own crop before harvest." The laughter rolled across the field. Emily climbed down from the tractor without saying a word. She brushed the dust from her gloves. Then she looked directly at Daniel. "If the fire reaches this farm," she said quietly, "those vines won't matter." Nobody answered. Walter finally stepped forward. His voice was calm enough that people leaned closer to hear it. "She's not cutting grapes." He paused. "She's cutting fuel." The contractors exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel folded his arms. "You really expect me to believe mowing healthy vines is going to stop a wildfire?" Walter simply nodded once. "It won't stop it. It'll change how it behaves." The younger men looked unconvinced. Smoke thickened above the ridgeline. Sirens echoed somewhere beyond the hills. Walter rested one hand on the Farmall's faded hood. Let me tell you about old tractors. People admire horsepower because it sounds impressive, but on a working farm, steady torque often matters more. Horsepower measures how quickly work can be done. Torque measures the twisting force that keeps heavy equipment moving when the ground fights back. Older cast-iron engines produce strong, predictable torque at low engine speeds. That meant a tractor like Walter's could crawl through rough ground for hours without straining itself. Clearing fire breaks were lighter, faster machines often lost traction or overheated. Emily climbed back into the seat. The Farmall rumbled forward again. Another road disappeared. Then another. By late afternoon, nearly 8 acres had been transformed into broad strips of bare earth, short grass, and scattered stubble. To nearly everyone watching, it looked like a season's profit had been sacrificed for nothing. Have you ever known you were right, while everyone around you insisted you were making the biggest mistake of your life? Sometimes the hardest part isn't doing the work. It's doing it while people are laughing. As the evening wind shifted, every conversation stopped at once. Across the western ridge, beyond the black oaks, a wall of orange appeared where there had only been smoke before. And for the first time that day, Daniel Mercer stopped laughing. The flames crossed the western ridge just after 8:10 p.m. on August 18, 1988. In the fading light, they looked almost beautiful from a distance. Up close, they sounded like freight trains rolling downhill through dry timber. Pine cones burst apart in the heat. Blue oaks crackled. Fence posts that stood for decades disappeared in seconds. Firefighters from Cal Fire's Howard Forest Station pushed bulldozers toward the advancing front. But the wind kept changing, carrying burning embers more than a quarter of a mile ahead of the main fire. Emily stood beside the old farmer with Walter, neither of them speaking. There was nothing left to argue about. Now the land would answer for itself. Daniel Mercer remained near his truck with the contractors who had laughed only hours before. Their confidence had faded with the daylight. Expensive boots that had never stepped into an active fire zone shuffled nervously through the dust as radios crackled with evacuation orders. One firefighter stopped beside Walter. "Did you make these breaks?" Walter nodded. "Every one of them." The firefighter looked across the carefully cleared strips running between the vineyard blocks. They were wider than ordinary access lanes and cleaner than most emergency fire breaks cut in a hurry. "You planned this." Walter answered quietly. "No." Emily spoke instead. "We practiced it." The firefighter stared. Then he climbed back into his engine without another word. Let me tell you about Emily Harper. People believed she had inherited a struggling farm. She believed she had inherited responsibility. Every winter since she turned 14, Walter had taught her something that never appeared in agricultural magazines. How to read the direction of afternoon winds by watching cottonwood leaves. How dry grass sounded under a boot before it became dangerous. How vineyards planted before modern irrigation often survived because their roots searched deeper than anyone realized. Most important of all, he taught her that every acre should have an escape plan, not for people, for fire. That was why Emily had spent 3 summers clearing brush along stone walls, trimming low branches from valley oaks, and mowing wide corridors that many neighbors dismissed as wasted ground. Every hour of work cost money. Every untouched weed could cost a farm. Daniel walked toward Walter, shaking his head. "I still don't understand." Walter looked at the approaching flames. "You will." The first embers landed minutes later. Dry grass beyond the western fence erupted almost instantly. Fire raced across the field with terrifying speed. Contractors scrambled toward their trucks. A water tender backed into position. For several long minutes, it looked as though the entire Harper property would disappear beneath a rolling curtain of orange. Then something changed. The flames reached the first strip Emily had cleared that morning. Instead of charging forward without slowing, the fire stumbled. It spread sideways. It searched for fuel that was no longer there. Firefighters immediately recognized the opportunity. "Hold this line." The shout echoed across the vineyard. Hoses opened. Water arced through the smoky darkness. Bulldozers widened the cleared strips while the fire hesitated just long enough for crews to attack it from both sides. Daniel stared in disbelief. "What?" He couldn't finish the sentence. Walter never looked away from the flames. Fire eats. Another pause. If you decide what it can eat. He watched another burning branch collapse harmlessly onto bare earth. You decide where it goes. The wind shifted again. This time it favored the vineyard. Flames pushed toward another section of Emily's property. Again they reached ground that no longer offered easy fuel. Again they slowed. Not because the fire had become weaker, because someone had thought several hours ahead instead of several minutes. Have you ever watched a problem that seemed unstoppable suddenly lose its strength because one person prepared before everyone else even recognized the danger? Preparation rarely looks impressive, until the day it becomes priceless. Daniel removed his hat. His face carried none of the confidence that had filled it that afternoon. I laughed at her. Walter nodded. I know. I was wrong. Walter nodded again. I know that too. For the first time since arriving, Daniel became quiet enough to learn. The battle continued through the night. The old Farmall Super M-TA never left the field. Its headlights carved narrow tunnels through smoke, while Emily used it to pull a heavy disc behind the tractor, exposing fresh soil ahead of advancing embers. The engine settled into its familiar rhythm, never racing, never complaining. More than 34 years after leaving the factory, it simply worked. The temperature gauge never climbed beyond normal. Oil pressure remained steady. The tractor had seen droughts, floods, and harvests. Now it was helping fight a wildfire. Some machines earned their reputation. Others inherited it. This one had earned every scratch on its faded red paint. Around 2:30 a.m., the strongest push of the fire arrived. Flames crowned through eucalyptus trees west of the vineyard, throwing burning bark hundreds of feet into the air. Firefighters shouted warnings as glowing embers rained across the property. Several landed inside the vineyard itself. Tiny fires appeared everywhere. Emily jumped from the tractor with a shovel. Daniel followed without being asked. Together they stamped out one ember after another. Neither of them spoke. There wasn't time. The laughter from earlier that day felt as though it belonged to another lifetime. Just before dawn, the main fire front finally passed eastward. Smoke still drifted through the valley. Ash covered the grape leaves like gray snow. The farmhouse remained standing. The equipment shed survived. Walter's old Farmall rested exactly where Emily had parked it, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. Beyond the western fence, thousands of blackened acres stretched toward the mountains. The Harper farm stood like an island surrounded by charcoal. Fire crews walked the property in silence. One captain removed his helmet. I've seen vineyards saved before, he said quietly, but I've never seen one saved because somebody had the courage to destroy part of it first. Daniel looked toward the rows he had mocked only hours earlier. His eyes stopped on the empty strips that had seemed so foolish. Then he turned toward Walter. There was something you knew, he said. Walter rested his weathered hand against the tractor's hood. There was something my father taught me. Daniel waited. Walter finally spoke, and what he said next would change not only Daniel's career, but the future of wildfire farming across the entire valley. Walter waited until the first light of August 19th, 1988 spread across the smoke-covered valley before answering Daniel. Ash drifted through the cool morning air like gray snow. Fire crews were still chasing hot spots along the eastern fence, but the worst of the wildfire had moved toward the hills above Clear Lake Oaks. He looked across Emily's vineyard. Rows of grapes still stood where everyone had expected blackened stumps. Then he spoke. My father used to say that farming isn't about fighting nature. Daniel listened without interrupting. It's about giving nature fewer chances to beat you. The words settled into the silence. No one laughed this time. The fire captain asked Walter if he would walk the property with him. Together, they followed the freshly cut fire breaks, measuring widths with long strides and examining how the flames had behaved. Charred grass stopped abruptly at strips of exposed soil. Burn marks climbed several vine trunks, but never spread through the entire vineyard block. The captain finally smiled. These breaks didn't stop the fire. Walter nodded. They slowed it. They gave us time. Walter smiled for the first time in 2 days. And sometimes time is all a farmer ever needs. Daniel knelt beside one of the burned rows. He scooped a handful of ash into his palm and let it slip between his fingers. "I've advised vineyards from Sonoma County to Mendocino County," he admitted. "I've always focused on production. More vines, more acreage, higher yields." He looked toward the empty strips Emily had created. "I never thought about giving up part of a harvest to save the rest." Emily answered quietly, "My mother did." Daniel turned. She pointed toward the oldest section of the vineyard. "She always said a farm shouldn't be planted for perfect years." Emily looked across the smoke-blackened hills. "It should be planted for the bad ones." Those words stayed with Daniel. "Let me tell you about Margaret Harper. She never appeared in farming magazines. She never spoke at agricultural conferences. Yet every February she walked every fence line herself, carrying pruning shears in one hand and a notebook in the other. She believed every neglected branch became tomorrow's problem. Every clogged drainage ditch became next winter's flood. Every patch of dry weeds became next summer's fire. People called her overly cautious. Walter called her wise. Emily simply called her mom. As cleanup began, reporters arrived from Lakeport and Santa Rosa. They photographed the burned hillsides and the untouched farmhouse. One photographer asked Emily to stand beside the Farmall Super M-TA. She refused. "Take a picture of Walter instead." Walter shook his head. "No." He rested his hand on the faded red hood. "Take a picture of the tractor." The photographer looked confused. Walter smiled. "It did more talking than either of us." Within days, newspapers across Northern California carried photographs of the old Farmall Park beside the vineyard that refused to burn. Some articles praised firefighters. Others praised preparation. Nearly all mentioned the unusual fire breaks that divided the vineyard before the wildfire arrived. Daniel clipped every article he could find. He carried them in a worn leather folder. The following week he returned to Emily's farm. Not with contractors, not with investors. Alone, he found Walter changing the engine oil on the Farmall. The old drain pan sat beneath the tractor, while warm oil flowed slowly into it. Daniel removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and asked the question Walter had been waiting to hear. "Can I help?" Walter handed him a wrench without saying a word. For nearly an hour, they worked together in comfortable silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I owe both of you an apology." Emily looked up from cleaning ash off an irrigation valve. "You already apologized." "I apologize for laughing." He looked toward the burned hills. "I haven't apologized for thinking experience could be replaced by confidence." Walter tightened the new oil filter. "Confidence grows quickly." He wiped his hands on a faded shop towel. "Experience grows slowly." Daniel nodded. "And slowly lasts longer." Walter simply smiled. "Let me tell you about that old Farmall one more time." It had never been restored for show. The paint had faded beneath decades of California sunlight. The seat carried a small crack, repaired with leather years earlier. One rear fender bore a dent from a falling oak limb during the winter storms of 1969. Walter refused to repaint it because every scratch reminded him of work already finished. Machines, he believed, should wear their history honestly. That afternoon, Emily started the tractor again. Its engine settled into the same steady rhythm that had echoed across the valley for decades. Children from neighboring farms gathered along the fence. One little boy asked why Walter didn't buy a newer tractor with air conditioning and more horsepower. Walter chuckled. "This one still wakes up every morning." The boy grinned. "I guess that's important." Walter looked at Emily. "It's everything. Have you ever watched someone keep faith with something old? Not because it was fashionable, but because it had never once failed when it truly mattered? In a world that celebrates replacement, there's quiet courage in careful maintenance. Autumn arrived with surprisingly healthy grapes. Yes, Emily harvested fewer tons than she would have if she had left every vine standing. But the neighboring vineyards that had ignored fire breaks harvested nothing at all. Insurance adjusters estimated losses across parts of Lake County in the millions of dollars. Emily sold enough fruit to pay every outstanding loan on the property. Not because she produced the biggest crop, because she was one of the few farmers who still had one. In October, the Lake County Farm Bureau invited Emily and Walter to speak during their annual meeting. Daniel attended as well. The same room that would have applauded his advice only months earlier now waited to hear from the quiet people he had once dismissed. Walter walked slowly to the front. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. He looked across the audience, paused, and began with 6 simple words. Let me tell you about listening. The room became so silent that even the old ceiling fan seemed to stop turning. And among the people sitting in the very back row was a gray-haired state forestry official whose decision over the next few weeks would carry Emily's simple idea far beyond Lake County. The man sitting quietly in the back row introduced himself after the meeting. His name was Richard Holloway, a regional planning official with the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. He had spent more than 20 years studying wildland fires, yet he admitted he had come to the Farm Bureau meeting expecting another discussion about equipment grants and emergency funding. Instead, he had listened to an elderly farmer explain patience, and a young woman explain sacrifice. Richard shook Walter's hand first, then Emily's. I think people need to hear this story, he said. Walter smiled. They don't need our story. Richard looked puzzled. They need the lesson. Over the following months, Richard invited Emily and Walter to speak with vineyard owners throughout Lake, Napa, and Sonoma counties. They never claimed to have invented wildfire protection. Fire breaks had existed for generations. What they showed was something different. Preparation wasn't a line drawn after danger appeared. Preparation was a habit practiced long before smoke reached the horizon. Many growers widened access lanes. Others removed brush that had been ignored for years. Several redesigned new vineyards with emergency fire corridors built into the original plans. Daniel Mercer attended every meeting he could. At first, he sat quietly in the audience. Then one afternoon, Richard asked him to stand beside the speakers. Daniel hesitated. I don't belong up there. Walter answered before Richard could. Yes, you do. Daniel looked surprised. I laughed. Walter nodded. And then you learned. He placed a weathered hand on Daniel's shoulder. The people who admit they were wrong often teach the strongest lessons. From that day forward, Daniel began every presentation with the same confession. I once laughed at a young farmer for cutting down her own vineyard. The room always became still. She saved that farm. I almost convinced her not to. No one ever forgot those words. 5 years passed. The burned hills above Mount Canocti slowly turned green again. Oak seedlings pushed through blackened soil. Wildlife returned. The scars remained visible, but they no longer looked like endings. Emily expanded the farm carefully, not by buying hundreds of new acres, by improving the 42 she already loved. Every new planting included generous fire breaks. Native grasses replaced invasive brush along the property edges. Water storage ponds doubled as emergency reservoirs for firefighters. Visitors occasionally questioned why she wasted valuable vineyard ground. Emily always smiled. I've seen the value of empty space. Walter continued farming into his 80s. His pace slowed. His standards never did. Each spring, he still changed the oil in the old 1954 Farmall Super M-TA. Every autumn, he inspected every grease fitting. The faded red tractor accumulated more hours, more scratches, and more stories. It never missed a season. In the summer of 1998, nearly 10 years after the wildfire, Walter handed Emily a small metal box. Inside were the original purchase papers for the Farmall, the receipt from the Ukiah Implement Company, old maintenance notes written in pencil, a photograph of Walter and his late wife standing beside the tractor on the day he brought it home. Purchase price, $2,350. Walter laughed softly. Best money I ever spent. Emily carefully folded the papers back into the box. They're yours. Walter shook his head. They've always belonged to the next person willing to care for it. That winter, Walter Briggs passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 79 years old. The funeral filled the small church outside Lower Lake. Farmers arrived driving pickups covered in dust. Firefighters came wearing dress uniforms. Daniel stood near the back, holding his hat in both hands. When the service ended, no limousine led the procession. Instead, the old Farmall started with its familiar steady rumble. Emily drove it slowly behind the hearse. No polished memorial could have honored Walter better than the machine he had trusted for nearly 40 years. Years became decades. Children who had watched the wildfire grew into farmers themselves. Some remembered the flames. Most remembered the lesson. Whenever new vineyard owners asked why certain fields sacrificed productive rows for wide-open lanes, someone eventually told the story of the young woman everyone thought had lost her mind. The story spread farther than Emily ever expected. Not because it was dramatic, because it was useful. Daniel eventually retired from consulting. Before he did, every young employee who joined his firm heard the same advice on their first day. If an old farmer disagrees with your spreadsheet, he would smile. Ask another question before you offer another answer. Emily never became famous. She never wanted to. She simply kept farming. The Farmall still started every harvest season. Its paint faded further. Its engine never forgot how to work. Grandchildren learned to drive at walking speed across the same fields where smoke once darkened the sky. Visitors sometimes offered astonishing amounts of money to buy it. Emily always declined. You can't purchase a family's memory. You can only borrow it. Looking back, people often remember the wildfire as the day courage saved a farm. Emily remembered something different. She remembered the laughter, not because it hurt, because it reminded her how easily confidence mistakes preparation for foolishness. Some of the strongest things you'll ever build won't look impressive until the day everything else begins to fall apart. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly prepared while everyone else questioned them, I'd genuinely love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, or an old mechanic who taught you that careful work today prevents heartbreak tomorrow. Those are the stories that deserve to be remembered. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who buried his grandfather's 1938 John Deere beneath a collapsing barn to keep it from being scrapped, only for it to change an entire family's future decades later, I hope you'll join me for that story too.